Welcome back to our ongoing series of preview videos for the Jurassic Park card game. We're going to be looking at some new species previews today, this time focused on species that are first seen and prominent in Jurassic World. I shouldn't say first seen, some of them are not first seen in Jurassic World. They're just more prominent there. First one, Akylosaurus. Exactly what I just said, right? It's in JP3, it's not first seen in Jurassic World. Me speaking poorly. Anky here is a pretty simple species, not too much to say about it. It's a 4 fame, so it's one of the higher fame total basic species. They come in 3 fame or 4 fame sets. The less special species are the 3 famers, and the more iconic ones like Ankylosaurus, Triceratops are 4 fame. Ankies here are pretty easy to contain, but they can be a little bit damaging when they do escape with a ferocity rating of 4, which is fairly high. The Anky's effect down here, and I should point out, these previews are not completely updated. I was on vacation for Christmas break, and I didn't really have time to go through and update some of these card images for the preview video. So you can see here that Ankylosaurus is listed as an armored dinosaur. Armored is obsolete. It's been replaced by Thyreophoran for the combination of the Akylosaurus, Nodosaurids, and Stegosaurids. So that's what it should be. It should be an herbivore and a Thyreophoran. And Ankylosaurus protects itself, but also adjacent species from becoming injured. Since it's an armored dinosaur, it's hard to hurt the thing, right? The reason it affects adjacent dinosaurs is more of a balancing thing than anything thematic to the Anky here. It's just to give it a little bit of an extra push. Because otherwise this effect is not particularly exciting, which is reflected in the relatively low rarity for Anky. 6 is actually probably the cheapest any of the 4 fame dinosaurs get. I might be wrong on that. I might be misremembering something, but it is definitely close to, if not the cheapest. Our next preview is Apatosaurus. Finally, one that is actually first seen in Jurassic World. The Apatosaurus here supports a herbivore-centric park build strategy by getting +1 income for every herbivore you exhibit in your park. Or, sorry, every herbivore that is in your park, not exhibited. That was a misspoke there. If the dinosaurs do escape, they are not exhibited, but that doesn't affect the income generated by Apatosaurus. And the reason Apatosaurus has this sort of effect on it is because the Apatosaurus is prominently seen really in just 2 scenes. There's the gyrosphere scene, where you see the Apatosaurs in kind of this mixed herd with the Parasaurs, Trikes, and Stegosaurs. And that's the motivation for this card effect, is that the Apatosaurus is kind of the big attraction of the gyrosphere, and it's interacting with all these other herbivores positively. And so, yeah, that reflects this. The other part you see from Apatosaurus is when the Indominus slaughters a bunch, and there is a card that reflects that, but it's not an Apatosaurus. That is a obstacle card that reflects the that damage that was dealt to the Apatosaur herd. So yeah, another fairly simple one, not too much to say here. You could see that despite this being a 3 fame card, it has a fairly high rarity of 9. And that's to reflect the fact that when your park is pretty well developed, it actually gets a rather high base income total. It is important to note that this +1 income for each herbivore counts itself, and your starting species that you always begin with in play will always be an herbivore as well. So in effect, this is always at least 2 income, which is already pretty good for what it is. And then our next preview is Dimorphodon, another Jurassic World original. The Dimorphodon is a fairly small species, which is reflected in its stats here. Part of the theming with pterosaurs, we'll see the other pterosaur in a second, at least the other one that exists so far, might be more in the future, is that they have high security rating, right? It's hard to contain a thing that can fly away. So the Dimorphodon has this pretty high security rating of 4, but the ferocity is only 2. So it's fairly likely to escape, but it doesn't do that much damage. And another way this stat distribution for the pterosaurs is reflected in terms of the gameplay is Dimorphodon's effect here. So Dimorphodon is cloned with 2 additional population. You always begin with 3 Dimorphodons, effectively. 1 represented by the species card, 2 by the population tokens. But whenever a Dimorphodon escapes, you lose a Dimorphodon because they fly away. So that's kind of the balancing thing here. You're given a leg up, but every time this thing escapes, you're taking a much greater penalty from than you would for any other species in the game, which makes Dimorphodon a bit of a lightning rod for other people who are looking to sabotage your park. Since it's got a pretty good chance of escaping and does this kind of permanent penalty when it does. So yeah, after that we got the Parasaurolophus. Now I really debated having this in the very first preview video for the Jurassic Park species because that's when the para first shows up. And additionally, the card effect here is actually based on its appearance in Jurassic Park and not Lost World or Jurassic World or JP3. However, the only time you see the Parasaurs is in the lagoon scene from a very long distance. There's really only the one shot with it. I have a different plan for that shot in terms of card game effects, so I really can't use the JP1 paras. And I really wouldn't want to use such a long distance grainy shot anyway. So I opted to go for the Jurassic World paras here because you get this pretty good close-up. You get a good shot of the para in Lost World as well, but the para in Lost World doesn't look as distinctive. The Jurassic World ones have kind of this more vibrant coloring. It's still like the same pattern as the Lost World paras. It's just a little more saturated, which makes it look a little bit better on a card. I don't like the CGI in Jurassic World. Let's just put that out there. But when it comes down to looking at a card art versus looking at a film, sometimes different things pop a little bit better. And that's why I went with these paras here. The Parasaur is a nice, cheap species with really low base stats. So it's a nice, safe species to add to your park. Very little downside. Not too much upside either, but it's something that's not going to backfire on you with this ferocity of 2 and security rating of only 1. This is pretty typical of Hadrosaurs. They're pretty chill species in the card game. The card text effect that Parasaur has here is that it can function as an upgrade in your paddock, as long as it's not sharing the paddock with a carnivore. And this is to recreate that Jurassic Park 1 opening scene with the Brachiosaurs and Parasaurs at the lake. That way you've got the Brachies and Paras in the same enclosure, basically. And the effect of playing this thing as an upgrade, what it does for you is it doesn't do that much because it doesn't add anything to the species. And it in fact blocks you from adding other things to that enclosure, to that paddock, which is not great, right? But it combos with adjacency effects. Like we saw previously, the Akylosaurus. Anky will give this thing protection from being injured when it's adjacent and in the upgrade slot. So you can have 3 dinosaurs adjacent to the Anky in your park if one of them is a Parasaur in the upgrade slot of the respective paddock that it's put into. There's a bunch of other adjacency effects that you can use with Para to capitalize on this bonus. There's, I believe I previewed the Corythosaurus, which should be one. That was in the JP3 preview species video from 4 weeks ago. And there's like some upgrades, some paddock upgrades that affect multiple paddocks, not just the one they're played in. And so you can kind of combine these effects to get an interesting benefit from this Para effect. Again, it's a 4 rarity species only anyway, so it's specialized getting this bonus. But it's not meant to be something that offers you some huge effect, because you got to have some of these species that are a little weaker early game species that are easier to bring into the park. Next we have our other pterosaur, the Pteranodon. I opted to go for the Jurassic World Pteranodon in the card game and not the Jurassic Park 3 Pteranodon, because the Jurassic Park 3 Pteranodons were quarantined and kind of sequestered away in the Sorna aviary. They weren't a species that was, on display. And I mentioned this in the other videos a lot, but the big center point of the card game is Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, because those are the 2 films that actually feature the actual parks themselves. So when it comes down to picking something from one of the other sequels versus those 2, I usually skew towards Park and World, because those are the actual displayed species. Now, Pteranodon here, again, has 4 security like Dimorphodon, because pterosaurs, they do like to escape from their enclosures on account of having wings. Pteranodon, being a larger dinosaur, is, well, larger pterosaur, but in game terms, they're species. Pteranodon, being a larger species, has higher ferocity here, so it is more damaging when it escapes. But it is higher income, higher fame. It's a much more impressive creature to have in your park. Also reflected in the rarity cost of 10 here, which is fairly high. Pteranodon has this interesting little effect here where when you clone the Pteranodon for the first time, it kind of fishes a card out of another player's hand and hauls it away with it. And that Pteranodon keeps that card out of the opponent's hand for as long as it remains safely enclosed in its paddock. And then the first time that Pteranodon manages to escape, the opposing player gets their card back from the Pteranodon. So this is another thing, just like with Dimorphodon, where it'll kind of act as a bit of a lightning rod, drawing attention onto it when players are trying to play cards to trigger escape attempts and breakouts. But if you manage to secure it and keep it, keep it happy, keep it safe, you will manage to keep the opponent from getting that card back, which is a pretty solid effect. It works really well in combination with something like the Dilophosaurus, which also removes cards from the other player's hand, allowing you to do a bit of a hand control strategy if you focus on a few of those species and some other support obstacles to back up that hand disruption. And finally, we come to our Jurassic World headliner. One of two. We're not going to get into the Indominus Rex in this video, but that is another headliner species that we're pulling from the Jurassic World era. I don't know if I mentioned it previously, but if you picked a headliner species from every movie, you'd probably have Rexy, and then you'd have like the Bull T-Rex, and then the Spinosaur, Indominus Rex, and like Indoraptor, right? Problem is, the species cards, the dinosaurs in the card game are represented by one card for the entire species. So you can't have a Tyrannosaurus and a Bull T-Rex. The game just isn't made that way. I've tinkered with the idea of having unique species cards, like the big one, Blue, the Bull T-Rex, stuff like that. Lady Margaret from the Telltale game, that kind of thing. But it's never worked out. Adding the population mechanic improved the depth of the game a lot, added a lot more interesting interactions. It gave players a way to always do something. Otherwise, sometimes there was a lot of lulls in gameplay where players were trying to draw into new species cards and weren't really doing anything. Whereas population as a mechanic allows you to always build up your park even if you aren't introducing a new species. But it really makes coming up with those like unique dinosaur cards complicated. It's something I'm still interested in doing. And if I do figure out a way that I like it, that feels earned, that feels like it belongs in the game, that doesn't feel contrived, then absolutely you can bet your bottom dollar we'll have a Bull T-Rex. But until then, that's not going to happen. Which means there's no headliner species from the Lost World, unfortunately. There really is no other big threat, main thing in that film beyond the Bull T-Rex. And so to cover that gap, my solution was to make Mosasaur here a headliner species. So Jurassic World gets two. And that's not unusual, really. I mean, Jurassic World has like the most advanced park, the most amount of species on display. So it's a good source to draw that kind of stuff from. So the Mosasaur here, we're looking at a 5 fame, like all headliner species. They are all exactly 5 fame. That's the only way you get a base total of 5 fame in your park, is your one headliner in your deck. The Mosasaur has a decent income total of 3 here. The big draw with the Mosasaur is compared to all the other headliner species, it's much easier to contain because it's a big flippery boy who cannot walk away. He's stuck in this tank. So that's why its security rating is only 2. Makes it very exceptionally easy to contain compared to the Rex, the Indominus, the Indoraptor, and everything else. The downside, though, is the Mosasaurus is rather large and fierce, reflected by its ferocity stat of 6, which I believe is the largest value in the game. Some of the ferocity numbers have changed a bit. 6 is either should be tied or the highest. I don't think I have a 7 anymore. But yeah, that's so I forget the numbers a few times because I've been through a few different balancing passes. in the different versions of the card game. At this point, the stats are pretty well finalized, but at this point, there's also 30 species cards or whatever there is in the game, so it's easy to forget the ranges on some of those numbers sometimes. So yeah, as long as you keep the MOSA contained, you don't really have to worry about that penalty on that 6 ferocity. But if a player is confident they can do something, play some obstacle to get the MOSA to break out, you will take a large financial penalty on its escape. Ferocity of 6 versus income of 3 means it's going to take you 2 turns to just break even every time this thing breaks out. And the other thing the Mosasaur does here is when it's cloned, you make an employee in a rival park extinct. This is the Mosa eating Zara, right? The Pteranodon drops the assistant girl Zara into the lagoon. The Mosa eats her, and she is then extinct. In terms of gameplay mechanics, I believe this was covered in a previous video, but extinct just means removed from the game. And, generally in this card game and in most card games, something that goes to the discard pile is much easier to get back than something that's removed from the game. In this case, something that goes to the trash is much easier to recover than something that goes extinct. So this effect is pretty powerful because it's an effect that penalizes an opponent attached to a species card. Fairly unique. There's a few other those we already saw. Dilophosaurus has an effect like that. Pteranodon has an effect like that. But they're not terribly common. There's only a handful of species that can be used to set back another player's park, which gives it a unique position. And then being able to just straight up snipe out their employee and get rid of it forever is pretty powerful. And that includes headliner employees. You can use this effect to get rid of another player's CEO. And since that's a headliner, that will be the only chance they'll have had to play that CEO that whole game. Thing is, you can't always count on your opposing player having a headliner employee in their deck, of course. So you have to, make that decision yourself of what you're really worried about is employees. Then you bring in the Mosasaur maybe as your headliner species to counteract that. So yeah, that's it for this set of previews. We'll be back in 2 weeks with some more previews, and then 2 weeks after that, we'll be back with another species preview vid as we kind of ramp up here to the beta release. I'm not going to say when I'm targeting that yet. My original plan might have to get pushed back a month or so, depending on how much work I can get done. I've got a bunch of cards that still need art and images created, and I got to update a lot of cards too. Like these cards in this preview video, for instance, I mentioned with the armored versus Thyreophorans subtype on the Akylosaur. There's a lot of stuff like that, just some minor terminology changes with subtypes in particular that needs to be done, and a little bit of cleaning up of these templates. You could see on some of these where like the coloration on the title bar and the border is different, and that's an artifact of how these cards are generated and the poor contrast apparently on the monitor I used to create these in the past, the template itself. So I have to go through all the cards and like fix the coloration on the borders and stuff like that. So it's a lot of like busy graphics design type work that's kind of keeping me from like really pushing out the beta. But it's also good because it gives time for these videos to maybe find an audience and to like maybe ramp up some interest in the beta for this card game. If you're watching this and this is something that really interests you, I would definitely appreciate if you know anybody else who would be interested in getting involved in this, because we are going to need playtesters in the upcoming months. So yeah, that'll be it for this video then. Until the next one.